You're listening to the Fresh Hell podcast. Fresh Hell contains stories of a disturbing and often graphic nature and is intended for a mature audience. Please don't let your kids listen to this, or they might turn out like us.
Hi, I'm Annie in the USA.
And I'm Johanna in Austria, and you're listening to your favorite international podcast. The podcast with two friends who never met in real life and meet once a week to talk about murder, mystery, and the macabre throughout history. Thank you for your support, your messages, your reviews, and, of course, for joining us every week for another episode of Fresh Hell. And I say, let's jump right in, shall we?
Let's. So, one thing before we get started, there is going to be the discussion of the death of a child today. It's in the second half, and I'll warn you again before we start that part of the story in case you'd like to stop, but just a content warning. So, we figure that we can't really talk about spooky season without talking about the reason for the season, and that is actually so much harder than I knew before this episode. Halloween has a really long and complicated history, but we found a great History.com article about it, so what we're going to do is read you some excerpts from that, because the History.com editors did a really great job covering pretty much everything. We're going to, of course, list to the entire article if you'd like to read it, and we definitely encourage you to do so. And I think, Johanna, you should start because it's the European history in the beginning.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
Quote, Halloween's origins date back to the ancient Celtic festival of Samhain. The Celts, who lived 2,000 years ago, mostly in the area that is now Ireland, the United Kingdom, and northern France, celebrated their new year on November 1st. Celts believed that on the night before the new year, the boundary between the worlds of the living and the dead became blurred. On the night of October 31st, they celebrated Samhain, when it was believed that the ghosts of the dead returned to Earth. In addition to causing trouble and damaging crops, Celts thought that the presence of the otherworldly spirits made it easier for the Druids or Celtic priests to make predictions about the future, an important source of comfort during the long, dark winter. To commemorate the event, Druids built huge sacred bonfires where the people gathered to burn sacrifices to the Celtic deities. During the celebration, the Celts wore costumes, typically consisting of animal heads and skins, and attempted to tell each other's fortunes. By 43 AD, the Roman Empire had conquered the majority of Celtic territory. In the course of the 400 years that they ruled the Celtic lands, two festivals of Roman origin were combined with the traditional Celtic celebration of Samhain. The first was Feralia, a day in late October when the Romans traditionally commemorated the passing of the dead. The second was a day to honor Pomona, the Roman goddess of fruit and trees. The symbol of Pomona is the apple, and the incorporation of this celebration into Samhain probably explains the tradition of bobbing for apples that is practiced today on Halloween. On May 13th, 609 AD, Pope Bonifacius IV dedicated the Pantheon in Rome in honor of all Christian martyrs, and the Catholic Feast of All Martyrs' Day was established in the Western Church. Pope Gregory III later expanded the festival to include all saints as well as all martyrs and moved the observance from May 13th to November 1st. By the 9th century, the influence of Christianity had spread into Celtic lands, where it gradually blended with and supplanted older Celtic rites. In 1000 AD, the Church made November 2nd All Souls' Day, a day to honor the dead. It's widely believed today that the Church was attempting to replace the Celtic Festival of the Dead with a related, Church-sanctioned holiday. All Souls' Day was celebrated similarly to Samhain with big bonfires, parades, and dressing up in costumes as saints, angels, and devils. The All Saints' Day celebration was also called All Hallows or All Hallowmas, and the night before it, the traditional night of Samhain in the Celtic religion, began to be called All Hallows' Eve and eventually Halloween. End quote.
There's a lot to unpack there. All right, so now we're moving on to American Halloween. So this is more from that same History.com article. Quote, the celebration of Halloween was extremely limited in colonial New England because of the rigid Protestant belief systems there. Halloween was much more common in Maryland and the southern colonies. As the beliefs and customs of different European ethnic groups and the American Indians meshed, a distinctly American version of Halloween began to emerge. The first celebrations included play parties, which were public events held to celebrate the harvest. Neighbors would share stories of the dead, tell each other's fortunes, dance, and sing. In the second half of the 19th century, America was flooded with new immigrants. These new immigrants, especially the millions of Irish fleeing the Irish potato famine, helped to popularize the celebration of Halloween nationally. Borrowing from European traditions, Americans began to dress up in costumes and go house to house asking for food or money, a practice that eventually became today's trick-or-treat tradition. Young women believed that on Halloween, they could divine the name or appearance of their future husband by doing tricks with yarn, apple parings, or mirrors. End quote. Yeah, we still do that. Do kids do... When I was a kid, a teenager, we would make these origami folded fortune tellers, we would call them, and you'd write things down, like numbers or colors or places, and, you'd do these games to figure out the name of the person you'd marry or how many kids you'd have. Was that a thing in Austria? Was that a global thing?
I think it's kind of a thing in Austria. It's called Himmel und Hölle, or Heaven and Hell. I'm not sure if they do it today, but we definitely did that kind of things, yeah.
Yeah. All right, so the article keeps going, quote, "In the late 1800s, there was a move in America to mold Halloween into a holiday more about community and neighborly get-togethers than about ghosts, pranks, and witchcraft. At the turn of the century, Halloween parties for both children and adults became the most common way to celebrate the day. Parties focused on games, food of the season, and festive costumes. Parents were encouraged by newspapers and community leaders to take out anything frightening or grotesque out of Halloween celebration. Because of these efforts, Halloween lost most of its superstitious and religious overtones by the beginning of the 20th century. So that explains why in America you don't have to be something spooky, which I think outside the U.S. and places that do traditional Halloween and trick-or-treating, as far as I know, it's supposed to be spooky, except here.
I think also because, like here, for example, Halloween is not a traditional thing, right?
Right.
Kids are doing it because we grew up with kind of Hollywood movies and these things. But we have Carnival, and Carnival is for dressing up. And so Halloween has to be spooky because if you want to dress up as something, whatever else, you do it on Carnival. And
Right.
Halloween is just creepy, spooky monsters, witches.
Yeah, all we have is Halloween. It's our only, dressing up holiday, isn't it? That's a good point. All right, so back to the article. It says, quote, "By the 1920s and 1930s, Halloween had become a secular but community-centered holiday, with parades and town-wide Halloween parties as the featured entertainment. Despite the best efforts of many schools and communities, vandalism began to plague some celebrations in many communities during this time. Between 1920 and 1950, the centuries-old practice of trick-or-treating was also revived. Trick-or-treating was a relatively inexpensive way for an entire community to share a Halloween celebration. In theory, families could also prevent tricks being played on them by providing the neighborhood children with small treats." End quote. So, yeah, that's a really good base history for us. Also, before the Second World War, trick-or-treaters would usually get homemade treats, but sugar was rationed during the war, and the practice of trick-or-treating became far less common. Of course, after the war, once rationing was gone, it came raging back. Sugar wasn't rationed. Candy companies were marketing store-bought candy as a safer and easier alternative to having to bake things at home, which, can you imagine today having to bake for Halloween? Even in a perfect world, let's imagine everyone's stuff is amazing. Like, we live in a pretty low traffic area, but I know people who will see like 500 kids, people who live in certain areas. But it's just, can you imagine having to bake like 500 cookies for, we buy candy. So in the U.S., we spend $6 billion annually on Halloween. It's second only to Christmas, which is impressive. And it makes a lot of sense because from childhood right through to adulthood, a lot of us buy a costume every year. Or worse, we make our own costumes every year, which anyone who makes their own costumes know is way more expensive than buying one. So that's your basic history of Halloween and trick-or-treating. But what we haven't talked about yet is the safety of trick-or-treating, which is actually so much safer than you might think. Despite 0 instances of people trying to just generally kill kids on Halloween, that's it. There are 0 instances. It's not a thing. Spoiler alert, we're just kind of debunking the reasons for it. But there are a few instances in U.S. history where someone was trying to poison kids, but does it really fit what they're warning you about for Halloween? I remember mostly not being allowed to eat anything that wasn't candy in a wrapper. By the time you started trick-or-treating, was that an issue, or was it always just store-bought candy?
I never went trick-or-treating. It's not... Halloween became a thing here maybe around the early 2000s.
Oh, okay. I don't know why I thought...
And it's still not really a big thing. Like, for the last 4 years, I really decorate a little bit and have candy at home because I always hope that some kids come over, but it's more for teenagers to go to parties and dress up as sexy mommy or something like that.
Sure.
But it's really not that big. And yeah, it wasn't a thing until maybe 20 years ago at all.
Isn't it funny? It makes me really sad I know that this is a common experience that a lot of the world doesn't trick or treat, but like so many of my joyful childhood memories are Halloween trick or treating, and it makes me sad that you didn't really get to do it.
Well, we have a lot of other things we do here.
That's true. I'm sure you feel that way I've never been terrified by Krampus. Not once.
Well, there you go.
There you go.
All right, so let's talk about the real-life instances that directly contributed to this very persistent urban legend. And the information I'm about to give you on this first crime comes from articles in the New York Times, and they are from 1964 and 1965. So, it's Halloween, 1964, Green Lawn, New York. It's on Long Island, part of the town of Huntington, and Long Island is, according to Wikipedia, quote, the longest and largest island in the contiguous United States. With a land area of 3,630 square kilometers or 1,401 square miles, Long Island is the 11th largest island in the United States and the 149th largest island in the world. Larger than the 3,140 square kilometers or 1,214 square miles of the smallest U.S. state, Rhode Island.
It's tiny.
End quote.
Tiny Long Island. Yeah, the Hamptons is nice, and so is Fire Island. It's all good.
So, Huntington, Long Island is on the North Shore. Mariah Carey grew up there. Yeah, she's not a part of this. The Pfeil family, I hope that's how they pronounce it, but it's definitely German origin.
Yeah.
So they were alive and well this Halloween night, 1964. We have 47-year-old Helen Pfeil. Helen was alone that night waiting for trick-or-treaters to ring her doorbell, so she could answer the door and pass out candy. And Huntington, like the rest of Long Island, had a massive population boom after the war, so they went from 30,768 people in 1940, that's oddly specific.
I know.
To 126,221 only 20 years later in 1960. So there would be definitely plenty of neighborhood kids looking for candy, and Helen was happy to hand out candy to children dressed in their favorite Halloween costumes. Unlike a lot of the world, Halloween costumes in the US are not required to be scary, as Annie said before. And according to a Reader's Digest article in 1959, the most common costume was Marilyn Monroe. Then was a hula girl, and then in 1961 it was Holly Golightly.
So good.
In 1962 it was everyone's favorite moose and squirrel, Rocky and Bullwinkle, and 1964 was the Beatles. And it's not until 1967 that we get Morticia Adams, and in 1968 it's Rosemary Woodhouse from Rosemary's Baby. And 69 was, of course, Astronaut. I mean, with the moon landing. And in 1970, the streets were swarming with hundreds of little Elvis impersonators.
I love that. This is a really good list. Yeah,
so
I like
interesting.
it. Yeah, so fascinating. I'm going to keep looking at that. I just like that you can be everything that you want. And I'd say it's more common that costumes aren't necessarily scary. This is also true in Japan, who have only been celebrating a bit, but we're going to talk about that more later.
We're going to post the list to our Facebook group.
Yeah.
So back to Helen. She's at home alone. She's passing out candy to, the Beatles. But every now and then older kids, teenagers, come to the door, and some of them, would you believe it, aren't even in costume.
Yeah, seriously though, I don't care how old you are. If you come to my door and ask for candy on Halloween, you get the candy. It doesn't matter to me what you wear. You get the candy. How old you are, take the candy. Parents, you look tired. You want some chocolate? Everybody gets candy. It's the whole point. It's the whole point, people. It's all about the candy.
Well, you might be okay with that, but Helen Pfeil was not okay with this.
Oh, Helen.
Helen did not think it was at all okay to keep trick-or-treating once you were too old in her eyes, whatever that means. After telling off a few kids, she really worked herself into a kind of is frenzy the right word?
I don't know.
Frenzy? I don't know. She was upset. She was very upset.
Yeah.
And rather than the little Halloween bags containing a few candies, she searched around her house and came up with a special treat bag just for the older kids. And when someone Helen didn't like the look of came to the door, they got a special package. 2 of those kids were sisters. That was 13-year-old Elsie and 15-year-old Irene Drucker. At the end of the night, the sisters poured out their candy bags to see what they had gotten, to see what looked good, and sometimes you get bags with homemade treats like popcorn balls or cookies, but the girls had never seen a foil-wrapped parcel before. And opening it, their remarks, thankfully, caught the attention of their father, who, after looking at the contents of the foil parcel, decided to call the police. And inside the foil was a dog cookie, a ball of steel wool, that ones that you use to scrub pans, and a small ant button. It's an over-the-counter poison bait, and it's sold for pest control, and it's about the size of a bottle cap. And they used to have skull and crossbones on it, and the word poison, and keep away from children and animals. So that was printed on that. They did contain enough poison to kill a child should they decide to chew on it. And after a thorough investigation by police who found several more of these packages in the hall of neighborhood kids, at least 12, and thankfully the kids remembered who gave them the little parcels, the little packages, and so the police quickly arrested Helen, who was arraigned on November 1st in court on a misdemeanor charge of endangering the health and life of a child. Her husband said on her behalf that she was thoughtless but not malicious, and the judge Victor Orguera said, quote, "It's hard for me to understand how any woman with sense or reason could give this to a child," end quote, and I agree.
Right. I think if she'd just given out dog cookies, that would have been all right. It would have been miserly and mean-spirited, and you deserved it if your house got TP'd, but, kids eat dog cookies all the time, so it's gross but not dangerous. This is not good.
No, I agree. Yeah, the poison took it over the edge.
Yeah.
The judge also felt she had taken very risky actions, and he sentenced her not to jail or a fine, but to the Central Islip State Hospital for observation. And here are the most interesting things Wikipedia has to say about the place. Quote, "The Central Islip Psychiatric Center, formerly State Hospital for the Insane, was a state psychiatric hospital in Central Islip, New York, United States from 1889 until 1996. The center was one of the 4 major hospital farms in central Long Island to house the sick from New York City. In 1955, it housed 10,000 patients, making it the second largest psychiatric hospital in the United States. It opened in 1889 to house the sick from Manhattan in what was called at the time the New Colony. 49 male and 40 female patients were admitted in 1889 for O&O, so that's occupation and oxygen, and R&R, which is rest and relaxation, there at the working farm. That sounds pretty nice, actually.
It does, right?
Patients cleared the land, constructed buildings, made the furniture and mattresses, sewed their clothing, grew crops, and raised dairy cattle, pigs, and chickens. After New York State bought it, it was renamed the Manhattan State Hospital for the Insane, although the for the insane part was frequently not included in articles, and the initial buildings grew to be a nearly mile-long interconnected series of buildings called, quote, String of Pearls, end quote. Until the Great Depression, patients would arrive by special hospital train with bars on the windows on a siding of the Long Island Railroad, end quote. And we have a photo of this rail car, and we will share it in our Facebook group. So, we aren't sure how long she stayed in the hospital, but that April she pled guilty to the 2 counts of endangering the health and welfare of a child. And lots of her friends and neighbors sent in letters on her behalf, and in June she was given a suspended sentence. She could have been fined up to $1,000 and spent 2 years in prison, had she gotten the maximum on both counts. So all things considered, she got off pretty lightly, I'd say. And the last great irony on the story, Helen was home alone that night because her husband was out with their 2 teenagers trick-or-treating.
It really is some pretty intense next-level hypocrisy there, right?
Yes.
Your teenage children are out enjoying trick-or-treating, but you're going to give poison to kids their age who come to your door trick-or-treating. I just can't. I get so angry at people who won't let teenagers trick-or-treat. They're the same people who will complain if teenagers get up to no good, but God forbid they want to do something fun and wholesome with their friends. You know, it's...
I mean, if they want to be kids...
Yeah.
They're gonna be grown-ups all their life, just...
Let them trick-or-treat.
Yeah. Exactly.
I feel very passionately about that. If you're not cool with the teenagers trick-or-treating, you can just flap off right now. You're not a real hellion.
Flap off.
Yeah, you're not our kind of people. But just give them the candy. All right. Okay.
You can come to my house and get candy. I wish somebody come to my house for candy.
I know.
All right. Our next case is definitely more disturbing, even though that really is an upsetting case as well.
Yeah.
And this one, as you said before, involves the death of a child.
That's exactly right. This one does involve the death of a child. And I think in your case, that woman was problematic for a lot of reasons, but I don't think she actually was trying to hurt children. I don't think that was part of it. I think she wanted to give them a mean trick, but I don't think her intent was for any children to actually eat the poison. And she said that she had, told them that it was poison when she handed it out and nobody was hurt. But our next case, it's not good. All right. So this happened in Deer Park, a suburb of Houston, and Wikipedia tells us the very important history of the town. Quote, Deer Park is near the site of the Battle of San Jacinto, where on April 21st, 1836, Texas won its independence from Mexico. Because the initial surrender treaty after the battle was drafted in Dr. George Moffett Patrick's cabin, Deer Park bills itself as the birthplace of Texas. The original cabin was located on Buffalo Bayou, where Rahm and Haas, now owned by Dow Chemical Company, established a chemical plant in Deer Park. A replica of Dr. Patrick's cabin is in the front of the Theater Courts building on Center Street. The Texas State Historical Sign Marker was relocated from the Dow Chemical parking lot to the replica log cabin home of Dr. Patrick, located at the Theater Courts building. In 1896, the community, with a population of 40, had a hotel, a general store, and 3 resident carpenters. By 1922, Deer Park had dwindled down to almost nothing, with 4 houses, 1 little schoolhouse, and an old hotel with a few scattered shacks along the railroad right-of-way. In 1928, Shell Oil Company broke ground on a new refinery. In the late 1930s, an independent school district was established. By 1940, the population had grown to 100. By 1946, however, the area began to flourish as Deer Park became the site of refineries and toluene plants for the production of TNT. It sounds like a little bit of a dangerous town.
Kind of.
I think there's actually been a couple of incidents where they had to shelter, like residents had to shelter during fires and things. Yeah. In 1970, the population was 12,773. In 1980, it was 22,648, so almost doubled. And our story takes place in 1974, so like right in the middle there. Flourishing town. This is where Timothy Mark O'Bryan lives. He's 8 years old, and he lives in Deer Park with his little sister Elizabeth and his mom and dad. His dad is Ronald Clark O'Bryan. Ronald is a deacon in the local Methodist church. I had to look that up, and according to the website glossary for the United Methodist Church, quote, a deacon is, quote, an ordained clergy person who is called to serve all people, particularly the poor, the sick, and the oppressed, and to equip and lead the laity in ministries of compassion, justice, and service in the world. In this capacity, he or she lends the church in relating the gathered community to their ministries in the world, thus connecting the church's worship with its service in the world. A deacon has the authority to teach and proclaim God's word, to lead in worship, to assist elders in the administration of the sacraments of Holy Baptism and Holy Communion, to perform the marriage ceremony where the laws of the state permit, and to bury the dead, end quote. So that was a shocker to me. I did not know that before looking it up. They have a lot more authority than I was expecting. Did you know that?
I'm thinking if it's comparable to the diacon in the Catholic Church.
Yeah. I don't know. I was just surprised. And he's an optician. Opticians make and fit eyeglasses. They aren't eye doctors. I need to see one soon. It's time to get a new prescription and get some new eyeglasses. So I looked it up, and U.S. News and World Report says that, quote, opticians made a median salary of $38,530 in 2020. The best paid 25% made $50,150 that year, and the lowest paid 25% made $30,540, end quote. And I'm only telling you this because Ronald had serious money problems. Ronald had a lot of problems. Ronald is a problematic person. On October 31st, 1974, the O'Briens sit down and have dinner with their neighbors. And after dinner, the 30-year-old Ronald was out early on a rainy night, still wearing his white lab coat from work, trick-or-treating with his 2 children, Timothy and Elizabeth, and with them is their neighbor Jim and his kids. And sometimes we get into very specific names and information. We do that when the people involved are really outspoken and want their story told. In this case, we're assuming everyone's doing their best to move on from something really traumatic. So we're trying to sort of be vague to protect their privacy, but this is all, it's easy to find if you want to take a look. Just look in our sources. So, back to Halloween. 1974, the most popular costume, Richard Nixon. How many films is there a Nixon mask in? Can we even...
Too many Nixons.
It's a lot, right?
Yeah.
And then I kept going with the list because it's kind of fun. So in 1975, it was Dr. Frankenfurter from Rocky Horror. 1976 was Charlie's Angels. 77, the year I was born, was everything Star Wars. And then we have to keep going just a few years to get to you because you're the baby in the podcast. 78 was Michael Myers from Halloween. And Johanna, in 1979, did you peek? Do you know the year you were born? What the most popular?
Absolutely no idea, but 79 was Alien came out, so maybe Ripley or still Michael Myers from the year before, because that's kind of fitting. I don't know.
It was Rocky Balboa.
That's a surprise.
I know. A lot of satin shorts and hairy chests coming out in the Halloween parties our parents went to. We also had, we have a friend, Stephanie, shout out to Stephanie, who has a dachshund named Mr. Rocky Balboa.
That's true, yes.
Yeah, that would have been quite the Halloween costume. I feel like I can smell that costume, and it's not great. Speaking of men you want to avoid at the Halloween party, let's get back to Ronald. So they're trick-or-treating, and the kids run up to a house with no lights on, which is the universal signal for that whatever reason, that house won't be able to give out candy that year. But sometimes kids try anyhow, so they'll run up and knock on the door, but there's no answer, so they run off to the next house. And the neighbor dad, Jim, he follows after the kids, and Ronald's like, I'm going to see if anyone's here. You go ahead. So he stays for just another round of knocking on this dark house. He then catches up with everybody, and he's got pixie sticks. Pixie sticks are basically paper tubes full of flavored sugar, and you just tip your head back and literally pour sugar down your throat. Oh my God, they're so good. All right. I found an article about them called 10 Throwback Facts About Pixie Sticks Candy. It's by Tessa Newell for foodbeast.com, and it reads in part, quote, in the 1930s, a candy company called the Fruzola Company of St. Louis was looking for a way to make water more fun for kids. Their solution? Sticks of colorful sugar that could be added to water to add some pizzazz, which they called...
That's what kids need.
Right? Just all you gotta do is pour about a tablespoon of sugar into that glass of water. They'll drink it right up, right? Which they called Fruitola. Sound familiar? But when creator J. Fish Smith realized that kids were far more interested in eating the tart sugar straight from the paper tube, they pivoted the product, framing it as a kid's candy and renaming it Lickmade. It's like Lik-M-AID. And my whole childhood, I've been pronouncing it I don't know. I have to ask Moose what we called them. I think we called them Lick-Aids or something, Lick-A-Maids. But now I'm like, oh, it's Lick-Maid. I know other people are like, oh, okay. And then the rest of you, it's fine. We're moving on. So the article explains that Pixie Sticks, Lick-Maid had a spoon where you could just, it was classier than a Pixie Stick was like a shot of sugar, where like Lick-Maid was more like, I am fancy and I'm going to eat this with a small spoon. And then Fun Dip, which had the white, chalky, flavorless sugar stick, and you'd lick it, and then you'd dip it into the sugar, and then lick the sugar off the...
Yeah, we have this too.
Yeah, so they're all the same family, and I think there was like citric acid or something to give it a tang, and not sour, but they're... My mouth is watering talking about this, even though I'm horrified by it now. Pixie Sticks are still the most popular Halloween candy in Georgia, and the article does give a cautionary tale for youth involving snorting Pixie Sticks or Lick-Maid or any of that stuff, because you know what happens when you snort sugar? You end up with maggots inside your nose.
What?
Yes.
That's not true.
It's true.
Seriously?
Swear. Yeah. Not like everybody, but it had like several kids had maggots up their nose. Because sugar got like lodged up in there, and don't snort things just to see what happens, kids. Just don't do it. Just say no. The article also tells us, quote, while regular Pixie Sticks are 6 inches of pure sugar, who can forget the sugar rush to end all sugar rushes that were giant Pixie Sticks? At lengths that varied from 15 inches to 2 feet long, giant Pixie Sticks were downright gargantuan. They were discontinued a few years ago. End quote. So... I believe the Pixie Sticks we're talking about that Ronald has in his hands were the 15-inch. I occasionally see them described as the 21-inch, but they're either 15-inch or 21-inch. Either way, it's a big fucking Pixie Stick. It's like a plastic tube the size of, I don't know, what's that tea with like chunks in it? Or like a milkshake straw. It's a big straw. Do you know what I mean?
Like boba.
Yeah, it's a big plastic straw. And so that's what he's got in his hands, and when he catches up to the kids and the neighbors, he hands the kids, the candy. He recognizes a passing group of kids. He's like, oh, I know that 10-year-old kid there from church. So he's saying something like, wow, look how big these are. You live in a nice neighborhood, huh? Like, you have some rich neighbors. Back at home, the kids, of course, want to have some of their candy before bed, and Ronald suggested Timothy try the Pixie Stick. When Timothy complained that the sugar was all stuck, he handed it to his dad, and Ronald took the large plastic straw and he rolled it between his hands to loosen up the powder, and then he helped pour the sugar into his son's open mouth. Timothy grimaced and said it tasted funny, and Ronald went and got him a glass of Kool-Aid, which Timothy almost immediately vomited up. He then began to have terrible convulsions and stopped breathing. Ronald called an ambulance, but by the time paramedics arrived, it was too late, and Timothy was dead. What could have happened? The autopsy determined that cyanide had caused the child's terrible, tragic death, and when they examined Elizabeth's untouched Pixie Stick, they found the top 2 inches of powder in each one of those Pixie Sticks was cyanide. 4 other tubes were recovered. One was found, this is horrifying, one was found clutched in the hand of a kid who had fallen asleep while trying to get the staples out of it. So...
Wow.
Right? Cyanide is a poison we've discussed before. This is information from the CDC. Quote, people exposed to a small amount of cyanide by breathing it in, absorbing it through their skin, or eating foods that contain it may have some or all of the following signs and symptoms within minutes: dizziness, headache, nausea and vomiting, rapid breathing, rapid heart rate, restlessness, weakness. Exposure to a large amount of cyanide by any route may cause these other health effects as well: convulsions, loss of consciousness, low blood pressure, lung injury, respiratory failure leading to death, slow heart rate. End quote. The only upside is I think this was a massive amount of cyanide and things went very quickly. It was the Pasadena Police Department who investigated. Bill Lanier had been on the job for less than a year, and this was his first murder investigation, but unfortunately for Ronald, he was good at his job. He wasn't easy to fool. There's a 2016 article for the Austin American-Statesman called 35 Years Later, Memories of Notorious Halloween Candyman Murder Remain Vivid. It's written by Eric Dexheimer, and he writes, quote, "Over the next couple of days, police tried to pin down the house where O'Bryan had received the poisoned candy. O'Bryan's recollections were oddly imprecise. Quote, "At first he kept saying, 'I don't know what home.' Then, 'I don't know which street,' Lanier said. But they only trick-or-treated on 2 streets. Then he said he didn't see the person. All I could see was an arm." After methodically walking up and down the neighborhood several times with the cops, O'Bryan finally directed them to a house. It was owned by a man named Courtney Melvin, who O'Bryan said was the person who gave him the deadly candy. It turned out Melvin hadn't gotten home until nearly 11 p.m. on Halloween. The guy had an ironclad alibi, Lanier said. He was a shift worker, a supervisor at Hobby Airport. He had more than 200 people who could vouch for him. Meanwhile, the detectives were uncovering more troubling information about O'Bryan. He'd recently sold the family's home to cover mounting debts. He still owed money to numerous creditors. He'd also purchased a $20,000 life insurance policy on each of his children a month earlier, in addition to policies he'd acquired for them the previous January. Halloween fell on Thursday. On Friday at 9 a.m., just hours after his son's death, Ronald had called to inquire about collecting on the policies. The more questions the police asked, the more suspicion fell on O'Bryan. The summer before, he had called an acquaintance who worked for a chemical company and asked him questions about cyanide, including what constituted a fatal human dose. Just before Halloween, he'd entered a Houston chemical outlet and asked about buying some of the poison, leaving after he learned that the smallest package available was 5 pounds. Police never identified where O'Bryan bought the cyanide either, and during his trial, O'Bryan maintained his only son had been poisoned by an anonymous monster, but the jury took less than an hour to convict him. His initial appeal was denied in 1979. Not only did he kill his son for money, the judges noted, but O'Bryan intended to commit other murder to do so. Quote, "When he intentionally distributed the 4 additional poisoned pixie sticks to the other children, the likely and predictable result of his acts was to cause their deaths also." End quote. The horrific death of Timothy O Bryan would prove to be a singular crime, the only deliberate Halloween poisoning fatality ever documented, said Joel Best, a sociology and criminal justice professor at the University of Delaware, who has studied supposed instances of October 31st candy poisonings and reported attempts to harm trick-or-treaters. Yet, he added, the case had a kind of echo chamber effect. Unproven rumors of strangers playing deadly Halloween pranks on children had been circulating for decades, and O'Bryan probably calculated that they would serve as cover for his crime, Best said. And while Timothy's poisoning was neither random nor anonymous, the resultant publicity confirmed parents' anxieties about stranger danger. In the days after Timothy O'Bryan's death, the police measured that fear in towering piles of candy. People were scared to death, Lanier recalled. "We put out the word, if you have any suspicious candy or if anything looks strange, bring it to us." We wound up with a whole room full of candy. People didn't go trick-or-treating around here for years. It was amazing how well publicized the trial was, Hinton said. There were reporters from London and Germany all over. Even today it's still talked about. I think it changed Halloween. End quote. So Hinton was the prosecutor. And yeah, I think it probably did change Halloween. And I would love to just take a quick moment and think about how strong Timothy's mother was after losing a child that way. She went to court every day. She testified against her husband in court and filed for divorce immediately. She never cashed any of the life insurance checks, saying that it was blood money and it disgusted her. She did later meet who we hope is a great guy. They were married and he adopted Elizabeth, and I hope that they had the family they all deserved. We wish them all good things. So, why did Ronald kill his own child? Money. He was $100,000 in debt, and he had had 21 jobs in 10 years.
That's a lot.
It's a lot. I mean, I'm not judging, but it's a lot. And I think it probably points to, my guess is he was a sociopath, that I think he was one of these people trying his best to pretend he felt feelings, but he didn't, and people find that out pretty quickly, don't they? If you lie regularly just to get what you want or to make your life easier, you're not going to keep a job for very long. But yeah, $100,000 in debt. The average cost of a new home in 1974 was $35,900. A new Corvette? $6,000. So $100,000, that's a lot of money to be in debt.
Do we know, did he have I don't know, a gambling problem, any addiction, I can imagine 21 jobs in 10 years could be, and I'm just really speculating here, that he kind of stole from the companies or embezzled money.
Yeah. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. I don't think there were any other problems. I was trying to find anything, but I really do think that if there was anything, the defense would have used it. And there was just nothing. There was no mention of him having substance abuse issues, mental health issues, nothing. It was, he's a John List,
Yeah. I was thinking about John List.
Yeah. So the jury agreed, and it took them 45 minutes to find Ronald guilty, and he became known as the Candyman. He was sentenced to die by lethal injection, and while I'm actually not really generally in favor of the death penalty, I'm kind of disappointed that he would die by lethal injection, because it was the newest and best way for state-sanctioned execution, because the previous method used, the gas chamber, had been deemed cruel and unusual, because the death caused by cyanide was so horrific. And I know I'm going straight to hell for thinking they maybe could have made an exception. Ugh, all right. Cyanide gas has been used, of course, most people are familiar with it because it was used so frequently during the Holocaust to assist in the genocide of the Jewish people. It was actually developed in the United States, though. But when it was used for the death penalty, it was thought to be a more humane treatment than the electric chair, which sometimes accidentally sets people on fire, and it could take a really long time, and people watching weren't comfortable with it. And then, of course, the gas chamber was different but equally bad, with inmates convulsing and vomiting and losing control of bodily functions. There was a really interesting article I came across. It's a June 2021 article for PBS entitled, quote, "Arizona refurbishes gas chamber and push to resume executions," end quote. And Jacques Biot writes this, quote, "The last prisoner to be executed in a U.S. gas chamber was Walter Legrand, the second of two German brothers sentenced to death for killing a bank manager in 1982 in southern Arizona. It took Legrand 18 minutes to die in 1999. Both brothers chose the gas chamber in hopes the courts would find the method unconstitutional. While Carl Legrand accepted the state's last-minute offer of lethal injection, Walter Legrand rejected it, saying he would prefer a more painful execution to protest the death penalty," end quote. So that is a really fascinating and disturbing article. We're not going to get into all of it right now. You'll find a link, of course, to this article in our sources. And I remember reading the John Grisham novel The Chamber back in high school, which is the first time I ever really thought about the death penalty. If you haven't read it, I remember it being really upsetting but interesting, thought-provoking. So this is obviously not an episode on the death penalty, although that could be an interesting future episode. I just thought it was really ironic that he killed his son with cyanide poisoning, and then when he was going to be put to death, they were like, oh, but not with cyanide. That's too cruel. Okay. There were loads of appeals, obviously, but they failed. And his last meal was a T-bone steak, French fries, ketchup, whole kernel corn, sweet peas, lettuce and tomato salad with egg and French dressing, iced tea, sweetener, saltines, Boston cream pie, and rolls. Not long after midnight on March 31st, 1984, Ronald was executed by lethal injection. He had a really, really long statement you can read if you want to. If you just type in Ronald Clark O'Brien, you'll find his Wikipedia page and it's there, but I'm not going to give any of his thoughts and feelings about any of this any airtime. He doesn't deserve it. When he was declared dead at 12:48 a.m., the crowd outside, there were people who were there and excited for his death, and there were people that were there protesting the death penalty.
I think that's always like this.
Exactly, right? You can imagine like the night of an execution, but I think one that might have been a little different is when I shouldn't, oh, well, I can laugh, who cares? Fuck this guy. But, so what happened was when it was announced that he had died, the protesters were showered with candy by the by the people who were there to see him go, so it turned into a real Mardi Gras kind of a situation. Yeah, they never did find out where he bought the cyanide, and it's true that the case is largely circumstantial, but I don't think anybody questions if he did it or not. He just needed money, and saw getting life insurance and then killing one of his kids, I think, is the best way to do that. And real quick, I don't want to dissuade anybody from getting life insurance. My parents got one for my sister and I when we were both babies, and when we were adults, we took them over, and I got really sick in my 20s, which is before a lot of people ever think about life insurance. So had my parents not done that, I would have no life insurance because no one would ever insure me. So getting life insurance for your kids is really, really smart, as long as you aren't planning to immediately murder them. But Ronald Clark O'Brien, also known as the Candy Man and the man who killed Halloween, he is a huge source of the candy danger feelings that we hear every single Halloween. And it does seem like in the area where all of this happened, trick-or-treating really did stop for a while. And it's a shame because he did give poison candy to other kids to make it look like it wasn't him that had done it. He absolutely did do that. 100% that happened. But his real goal was actually murdering a member of his immediate family. You know, he might have accidentally killed other kids to cover it up, but I don't think this really counts as a stranger's poisoning your children.
Yeah.
You know, it's not what we think of. You know what I mean?
Absolutely, yeah. Isn't there also this kind of urban legend about razor blades in candy and apples and things like this?
Exactly. Never happened. It's never happened. People have put things in and then contacted the news for like 5 seconds of fame, you know? But as far as I know, there's never been... It's all just made up hysteria. But there were 2 instances of intentional poisoning that we need to mention briefly, I think, because they're their own episodes for sure, but they do bear mentioning just in their impact in the public. I don't know. So the first is the Tylenol poisonings. In 1982, someone tampered with bottles of Tylenol capsules. Tylenol is acetaminophen. In the UK, it's called paracetamol. I'm not sure what your equivalent is. Do you call it either?
Paracetamol. We have it.
Paracetamol, yeah. So it's one of the most popular pain reducers and fever reducers. And someone went and tampered with bottles of medication. They opened up the capsules and put cyanide inside. And this did cause the death of 7 people, not to mention other copycat crimes. The Tylenol poisonings are still unsolved, and I'm sure that we will discuss them in a future episode. But again, yes, there was poison on the shelves. There was poison in the world, but they weren't poisoning Halloween candy.
The Tylenol poisonings have been on my list forever. They changed the design of the bottles.
It's a really interesting case. We're definitely gonna, we're kind of, the Tylenol poisonings in this one Johanna's about to tell you about they'll be their own episodes in the future.
Yeah, in March of 1984, so the same year and month as Ronald Clark's execution, there was a bizarre and very disturbing string of blackmail, threats and poisoning of candy in Japan by a group known as the Monster with 21 Faces. And in October of that same year, they informed the moms of the nation that they had put poisoned candy on the shelves, and it turned out they were telling the truth. And thank God nobody died from ingesting poison. An investigator of the case died horrifically by suicide. He was haunted by the fact that he could never find the criminals. This case, too, is still unsolved, but one thing is important to note. They didn't celebrate Halloween in Japan in 1984. So while someone was poisoning candy, it wasn't Halloween candy. Halloween didn't start in Japan until 2000, like I said, over here the same. And when Disneyland Tokyo and Universal Studios started offering the same sort of costume parties, spooky parades and fright nights they do in the US, that's when it all started in Japan too. They don't do trick-or-treat in Japan either. It's more an excuse to get dressed up as something fun, but not necessarily scary and, just have a good time. Japanese spooky season is August, when they celebrate Obon, which is the Buddhist Day of the Dead, when they believe that the ancestors return to visit relatives.
Yeah, I do love the Japanese culture's willing to, any excuse for a costume party. I've done the Not So Scary Halloween party at Disney. It was awesome. I'm too afraid to go to the one at Universal. It looks legitimately frightening, and
I would love to.
You should. I support it. I
think it's too many people nowadays for me.
Probably, right?
Yeah.
The last rumor I want to put to bed before we finish this episode is the idea. We see it here all the time. I don't know if you get it over there, but because Massachusetts is one of the growing number of states where marijuana, cannabis is legal, there's this thing every year about be careful, make sure that your kids don't get any edibles. People are going to give your kids edibles. And I don't know where this reefer madness bullshit rumor came from. I assure you, no one wants to give your children their edibles. They're not cheap. They're like around $5 a piece. I mean, the price obviously varies by dose and brand and all manner of things, but they are not cheap. It would be like saying, look out, this year people are going to be handing out your kids really expensive imported beer. It's like, no, they're not. That shit's expensive. No one's giving that to your children. No one is going to spend that money to get kids accidentally high. But I also want to assure you that even if they did, no one's ever died of a marijuana overdose. It doesn't happen. It's not a thing. So if you hear this nonsense in the rumor mills, let it go. The biggest risk you have trick-or-treating, your kids trick-or-treating, is the same as it was when I was a kid, and that is don't get run over by a car. Pay attention. Make sure you're visible. Make sure that you're not going to trip over your wizard cloak or step on your princess train and take a header, because I've done it. Make sure you have high-vis stuff on. They have so much better stuff now than they did when we were kids. You had to wear like a fucking high-vis safety vest over your princess outfit, which you had long underwear on underneath because it was snowing. I don't know why this was my favorite holiday. It sounds like a nightmare. But yeah, I know people know what I'm talking about. That's it. Traffic safety. Traffic safety, people. Billions of kids. Billions. Now, I didn't look it up, but I think that's probably an accurate number, wouldn't you say, have trick-or-treated since trick-or-treating began?
I'd assume, yeah.
Yeah, billions. Billions and billions of individual trick-or-treat scenarios happening. And guess what? If it happens, you're going to hear about it. We hear about everything now. And the news runs scary teasers. It's a draw, right? They want you to tune in and watch. Right now, everybody's talking about rainbow fentanyl. They're saying, look out, check your kids' Halloween candy, make sure there's no... Who's giving children rainbow fentanyl? It's not happening. So let's stop panicking about it and focus our panic on things worthy of it, like those spiders that are supposed to be making their way up the United States East Coast. Where exactly are they in their journey? That's something to panic about. Your kid getting a weed gummy? Don't panic. It's fine. Do you have anything good this week?
My something good is that we had really nice weather the last couple of days. Blue skies, sunshine, but this kind of cool weather already, and the leaves were turning red and yellow. And we took such nice walks, and it was just lovely. And that's my something good.
That is
Morning
lovely.
walks with the dogs and my husband.
That's really nice.
In fall.
Yeah.
How about you?
I have friends coming to visit, and I'm super, super excited. I have a friend and her partner are coming with their kids who I haven't met yet. So I'm over the moon excited to be having my friends over from the UK. Yeah.
I can imagine.
Yay. I feel bad because I'm still so tired from COVID that I feel like it's going to be a lot of like, you go ahead and tell me about it after, but it's still going to be great. It's going to be great.
Of course.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, I'd say that's it. If you enjoyed this episode or any of our other episodes, please do us a huge favor. Go to your podcast app and check if you can leave us a rating and or review. It really makes our day. What else? Go to our webpage, freshhellpodcast.com. There you find links to our merch store where we are still selling spooky fuckery, t-shirts, tell your bed, we said hi, t-shirts. And a mug with a skeleton, and on the back it says, I just want to lay down and die.
Yeah, I need to get that mug.
Our Patreon. You can find us on patreon.com, search for Fresh Hell Podcast. We have 3 tiers. October has been super quiet there. We're sorry, but we will make it up to you next month with 2 game nights.
I have some big things happening for Patreon that I'm really, really excited about, but I can't talk about it yet because it's too soon. But I'm going to be traveling places and sharing things with you, and it's It's kind of exciting stuff, Patreon. So I'm going to try to get my act together and learn how to make videos. Yeah, we'll see. It's going to be fun. Come on this journey with me. It'll be good. Our email is freshhellpodcast@gmail.com. Facebook. Come join our Facebook group and say hello. If you can't leave a review anywhere, you can leave one on our Facebook page. We have a new page. So we have the Facebook group. That's like, do you want to come and interact with everybody, have discussions, look at memes, houses, architecture, history, pets, spooky stuff. That is our Facebook group. And then we have a Facebook page. And if you like our Facebook page, that is a much less often, you don't have to interact in any way. You'll just see, I'll post when there's a new episode. We'll post when, I don't know, something, lots less posting.
Yeah. It's mostly about the episodes.
My brain is junk. I can't even talk words are bad. It's fine.
I think that's it. Please tell your pets we said hi. Hug them, cuddle them, give them treats.
Yeah, very specifically, tell them Jam, Leela, and Opus send their regards.
Yes, that is a very good point. Be kind to your fellow human being, at least once. I mean, don't let them walk all over you, but you know what we mean.
No.
And be kind to yourself, and that's the hardest part of it all.
It is, always. And if you are going through hell,
keep going. Tschüss.
Bye.